Good evening, everyone. Good evening, and thank you very much. I have to say many thanks to the participants in the workshop that, after long hours of discussions, are still with us. They are still committed to the discussions and to listening to what development is and what development is not. So thank you very much for remaining after the long hours of today and yesterday. Ashwani himself was wondering whether people would be present for his talk. I assured him that they would, and I think that I won. I was right. People are here. Thank you very much also to those who joined us, or those who were not in the workshop and have interest in listening to what Professor Ashwani Saith has to tell us about the development of development theories, paths taken and not taken. This is the title of Professor Saith's talk. Just to introduce him very quickly, Professor Ashwani Saith has a very long CV, and deservedly so. He is an emeritus professor at the International Institute of Social Studies in The Hague, Erasmus University now in The Hague. Someone here was a student at the ISS. Professor El Said was a student at the ISS many decades ago. He is Dean Emeritus of the School of Liberal Studies at BML Monjal University in Gurugram, India. He's honorary professor at the Institute of Human Development in New Delhi. Professor Saith obtained his PhD in economics from Trinity College, Cambridge, United Kingdom, and held research and teaching positions at various institutions, including the Delhi School of Economics, Cambridge, Oxford, and London School of Economics. He also served as professor of rural economics at the International Institute of Social Studies in The Hague, and held visiting professorships at the Center of Development Studies in Kerala, at the Rabindranath Tagore Center for Human Development Studies, University of Calcutta, and Institute of Development Studies, Calcutta, among others. His research and publications cover a wide range of topics, including official poverty measurement methodologies, millennium and sustainable development goals, comparative institutional analysis of China and India, policy frameworks for socioeconomic security, structural change and macroeconomic reforms, democracy, populism, plutarchy, agrarian change, rural development, ICT, and migration. He has worked closely with civil society organizations like SIWA in Ahmedabad, MP Foundation, Hyderabad, on gender empowerment, elimination of child labor. There's nothing here about your stint at London School of Economics, where you were director of the Institute of Development Studies at LSE. Let me add this. His recent research focuses on the history of economic thought, particularly on the evolution of Cambridge economics in the post-Keynesian era and Asian economic development, with a comparative focus on China and India since 1950s. I have to say that it gives me immense pleasure to introduce Ashwani because beyond his being an exceptional academic, is a very close friend and a very old friend. And this is something that brings him and his spouse here present very close to my heart. In our two-day discussions, Ashwani, especially in the first day, Raoul Prebisch kept returning to our discussions every session, twice or three times at least. Prebisch, all the time, Prebisch, Hans Singer was brought into discussion after Prebisch because Prebisch and Singer, of course, you cannot separate Singer from Prebisch. And then Richard, in one of his interventions, mentioned Arthur Lewis. Of course, Lewis precedes Prebisch. And then I think Mustafa mentioned Samir Amin. You mentioned Andre Gunder Frank, and others. So and we heard about interventions about ISI, inter-substitution industrialization. We heard about dependency theory. We heard about how development is seen by neoclassicals as opposed to structuralists and dependentistas. So, in fact, we have been discussing this, but without a link between the different ideas that emerged in our discussions yesterday. So I guess your talk will probably be about how to bring a link to these ideas and how the development theory developed. And I very much like the idea of development of development theory. So I think we are all ears, and we are eager to listen to you. The audience here, I think, joins me in expressing this eagerness to listen to what you have about the development of development theory. And you either talk from here, if you wish, talk from the lectern, you're most welcome. Ashwani, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ibrahim. It's a pleasure to be here. Beautiful surroundings, wonderful colleagues. I've heard about Arab hospitality, but now I think in the last few days experienced it again. I've been reminded of it in personally and intimately, and so thank you. I think it's also the right time to apologize, because at the end of a day where you've been arguing in one closed room from 10 o'clock till 6 o'clock, or nearly 6 o'clock, here we are, for another, as long as it takes. So my apologies for that, but you say there are people here, but in India normally, to get a busload of people, you have to pay about 500 rupees a bus. So we can discuss this another time, compare the prices between Egypt and India. No, I really am very, very pleased, and I am pleased to see other people here as well, and also colleagues. I don't think much that I will say will be new to most of you. But there are some things which perhaps sometimes need to be said again at certain conjunctures, because with the conjunctures, the meaning also changes. You don't step into the same river twice. And the topic which I think Ibrahim and Amr actually selected from the list which I sent, I have to say to you that they asked me, can you tell us what sort of topics could be there? So I sent 5 or 6 topics, thinking they would say, okay, one topic, you speak on this. And Ibrahim, I got a thing back which ticked all the boxes. So this is the first of these, but anyhow, it's my pleasure and privilege. So the topic is very broad. I've kept it more like that because I understand this in the nature of a conversation. And and there's no written paper on this. There is a written book, which is very big. I will not go into that because it's not feasible. It's very viable, but some comments will come in. The topic is very broad, and that should make for a free conversation where I think your interests will all, in some way or the other, come in. So, development theory. I'm thinking here largely of development theory in terms of economic development. I'm not going to go into postmodernism, and it's not to do with the development of the child. No, it's not. It's economic development mostly. Development economics is taken to be a branch of economics, mainstream economics. Mainstream economics does not much admit the existence of such thing called development economics. Is the application of mainstream economics to issues of development, and that's what it is. So development theory, which I have in mind, which I'm talking about, is already, as you mentioned, Ibrahim, pings all those other names. Whether it's Arthur Lewis, or you're talking about Prebish, or you're talking about Andre Gunder Frank, or we are talking about many others in this. And they certainly are not mainstream economists. And they would be classified as either economists of theoreticians of economic development, or they'd be heterodox economists or structural economists, and so on. So in those traditions. So that's the kind of an area that my talk is about. But mainstream economics, I'll have some comments to say. Most of them quite rude, I have to tell you. But that's well deserved, I think. So I start with economics. I think economics, there's no point in studying something for its own sake. Economics is a social science. At least mainstream economics doesn't accept itself as a social science. It regards itself as a separate discipline. It's a scientific discipline, and the other disciplines are not scientific, so it doesn't belong to the social sciences. This is the formal position in the Netherlands and in Europe, by the way. You're making grant applications. You will, economics and social science will go in different places. Economics, I think broadly, now I'm talking about economics not in a mainstream way. There has to be some public purpose to it for social science as well. So, and that's my concern in this talk, whether economics as we receive it at this point in time, the dominant, hegemonic, I'm using words that we've quite, discussed or used, form of economics, which is mainstream economics, which is you would find in most departments of economics across the world. And that would be regarded, I think, fairly to be called neoclassical economics. Now that economics is, you can ask the question, there are other kinds of economics, made from mainstream and neoclassical economics, which is a broad category of heterodox economics, which takes different sort of approaches, based on different premises, different assumptions, and different disciplinary boundaries. That also has to be said. So the question is that economics has to have a public purpose in some form. It has to contribute to the development and to the well-being of human beings. And now, mainstream economics has its own view of how it does that, and others have a different view. So that's going to be one of the points about this talk, whether mainstream economics, which has dominated the subject now, I would say differently for UK and Europe and differently for the US. But certainly you will say that since the 1960s, somewhere there for the US and somewhere from the late 70s and 80s for the UK, it has dominated in university departments. So that's I'm addressing that kind of economics and say, has it lived up to its need to perform a public, to stand up to public purpose? So for that I would say, where are we now? you can say, well, economics, the subject is ideas, and how do ideas change the world? So if something is happening which is going wrong in the world, you can't blame it on the theory, you can't blame it on economics. Well, yes and no. Because economics, if it's to serve a public purpose, has to have a explicit link with policy, with interventions and the nature of our interventions. And policies, we would believe, have to have some role with regard to how the world is shaped, and if a problem comes up, how we address it. So I think you cannot plead the fifth and say, oh, well, it's economics with nothing to do with what happens. We just do economics. No, it's meant for a particular policy purpose. So we can ask the question that if we see things in the world which we think are problematic, why did they get there? How did they get there? And wasn't economics able to sort those out? So what was their position in that regard? So here I would just want to say quickly, and you'll be all familiar with it, we live in a world of crises now. There are multiple crises, ongoing, overlapping, interrelated. Of course, climate change, we know, but there's an environmental crisis which is distinct from climate change crises. The loss of species and many other things which are happening there. I think the intervention of technology into various aspects of agricultural production and so on, which also can constitute risk factors. So I would say that's one. We know about the financial crises, about that crash and that collapse, and that point will come up very soon, because when you talk about Keynes, it is the question that every individual can be rational, and a collection of rational individuals actually produce a result which is not rational. Because that's the way the behavior interacts, or does not interact. So that is the kind of heart of a Keynesian proposition. So we have financial crises in this regard. So then and that relatedly debt. We have a fantastic, I think, level of inequality at this time, which is, you could say, not seen since the Gilded Age. You can have to go back to the 1920s or something in the US to see that. And at this time, numbers are not interesting in this talk, but the extent of inequality, I think, has almost never been higher in terms of economies. You can think, and so this both applies to wealth, it applies to incomes. We used to talk about inequality in Latin America being the highest almost. But at this time, Indian inequality in wealth is higher than in Latin America. And that's happened very quickly. China used to be egalitarian, where wealth inequality was not relevant because property was not owned in this way. But now the degrees of inequality which you have are matching those for India. So very high. Samuelson in 1948, in his book, he said if you take a child's block, building, like those toy blocks which you have, A, B, C for cat and B for something, if you take those blocks and we say each block is like $1 of income, he says most of us would be within, a yard off the ground. He says, but if you go up, the upper end of it is the Eiffel Tower. That was in 1948. If you got to the 1960s, it's not the Eiffel Tower, it is Mount Everest. I mean, I've done some sort of a calculation. If you come along into the 2006-8 area, you come, which is actually going outside into space. So Bill Gates had to climb up those blocks to put his last dollar on top to say it's a bit more. It would be a long ride. He'd be very close to God, isn't it? I mean, gates of heaven. He'd be at the gates of heaven, so Bill at the gates of heaven, I think that. So inequality is a crisis, very major, big. There's a crisis of employment. And this is not a crisis in the sense that it is something which has happened spectacularly overnight. It's a rising, slow crisis which is building up, is creeping up, and has been creeping up. And there is no sign, and there is no credible reason at this point in time to believe that that crisis is not going to get worse. Because the technological not interventions, but developments that we see at this point in time, whether it's robotics or it's artificial intelligence, and other forms of mechanization, they more or less guarantee that there will be job losses. Productivity will rise, job losses will take place. But if you look at the demographies of developing economies, and even for advanced economies, I think there's already high levels of unemployment, and you're not able to absorb these people for the foreseeable future. Now, if you couple the two together, inequality being very high, and employment being actually not up to it, we get a crisis. We get a crisis because there's a kind of a mass entitlement failure, to use one of the terms from Professor Sen, in the form of lack of livelihoods, which are really for people who work. I mean, if you're in agriculture, that's another kind of a crisis. So that's another type of thing. And then I would say the other crises, which are not necessarily purely to do with economics, but the economists should have something on it, and that's health and the pandemics. We do get those, we have that, and of course conflicts. Conflicts, you can say, are exogenous. I don't believe they are exogenous. I think conflicts that we have at this point in time are very much to do with, at the core of it is contestations of power, or they are hierarchies of privilege, power of some category of human beings over others, denials of human rights, which are not connected directly to economic states, but which are, what shall I say, they are anti-human attitudes, in my view. And we have enough examples of these, and some of these are, I think, a stone's throw from here at this point in time. So here are a lot of crises. Now, if I look at those economic crises and ask the question, hey, financial crisis, how come it keeps coming back? What about the employment crisis? What does mainstream economics have to tell me about this? And about employment, the simple story of neoclassical economics, cut down to the bone that we actually taught from the start, is, supply and demand. So if something is actually in excess supply, the price of that will come down, demand will go up, and then it will become an equilibrium point, and applies to every commodity. And labor is a commodity, it should apply to labor, but it doesn't. So that was always the problem, which was coming on from the late 19th century onwards into the 1920s and 30s, and that was this problem which the classicals, also then the neoclassicals, could not resolve. The classicals had a similar, they had a kind of a theory which was not dissimilar. So when a person like Keynes comes along, and the Keynesian group in Cambridge, asks that question and gives a resolution to that, Keynes criticized both the neoclassicals as well as the classicals in the same way. He said they both overlooked this, they got this wrong, this is not right. So I think now, so here we are, we have these crises again, financial crisis again in terms of Keynes, as I said to you, irrationalities of systems, a lack of governance which was required on top. So, so I think there's a good case to be made for putting mainstream economics in the dock and say you could not answer these questions. And yet mainstream economics has carried on, as I said, for nearly 60 years, 70 years in terms of the current form that we have. Before that, there was a break into heterodox economics, but the same mainstream economics was there from the 19th century onwards. It comes up from, if you look from Adam Smith is meant to be the father figure of this. Yeah? So there is a question to be answered there, and I think it shows that this kind of mainstream economics can't and doesn't perform that function. Let me pick it up a little bit from, I mentioned Adam Smith. Let me take, here's something about paths taken and not taken, a little bit of a resonance there. Adam Smith, almost everybody, father figure of economics. I fail to see where the mother is, but he's supposed to be the father. But, we know it for the invisible hand. Yes, the market will do the job. But if you read Adam Smith carefully and with an open mind, you need to know 2 or 3 things about it. You probably know all of them, but I mean, I'm here to be able to speak about some of these things. One is, of course, that he's talking at a particular historical conjuncture. where economic transactions are very strongly controlled by the powers that be. That's governance structures. And these are feudal, controlled by not by democratic countries and states, but actually by the privilege of power of the rulers. Applies to trade, applies to where production can happen and so on, where people can move. So his main proposition is that if you take rid of all these and let the markets do the work, let factors move, let people move, let products move, there'll be greater efficiency and there'll be better production. So that's what he's saying, that we are actually, with all this earlier system that we have, which is also mercantilist, that this is not the way to go. If you open it, you get development. And hence, the invisible hand leads to development. Okay, that much, fine. But there are some other propositions there. The other proposition there, and this is very often people don't bother with, is he says that the division of labor in society depends on the size of the market. Now, this is a very major, to my mind, this line has some very deep implications. The division of labor in society depends on the size of the market. So if you're sitting alone making some product, well, you'll do this, and the next operation, you do all of them. But if you have to sell a lot, then of course, the size of the market is large, you can specialize. You can have one machine for this, another worker for that, another something else for this, and so your productivity will be much, much higher. Now, the other side of productivity being higher is the cost of production is lower. So here you have a situation directly that scale economies are being explicitly introduced into the system. If you have a larger market, costs of production go down. You're getting scale economies. And if you get scale economies, your supply curve is actually drifting downwards. It's not going upwards. And when you have that, you have instability and no guarantee of an equilibrium. So here you have, so on the one side, it disturbs the notion that there's going to be automatic equilibrium. That's one. But more interestingly, as far as I'm concerned, it actually is giving you one of he's thinking of it as a growth economist. He's thinking of it as a growth economist. Because where does the change come from? If you have a large market, you have technological change, you have specialization, and there are scale advantages. And with that, you have higher productivity, which gives you higher growth. Well, that is almost exactly the agenda for industrialization that was being promoted by Nicky Kaldor in Cambridge. And he was the apostle of industrialization. And his main idea was there are economies of scale when you go to manufacturing, and that gives you productivity increases, and that gives you growth. That was the idea. And if you think of the Japanese miracle times, it's exactly that. You produce on a massive scale, costs of production come down, you can outcompete anyone, and you go out. So I think that's something which I think there's a misreading, in my view, and that reading of Adam Smith as a growth economist rather than just that invisible hand, I think that has somehow been suppressed because it disturbs the idea of equilibrium, everything happening automatically in the markets. The other point about Adam Smith, which people forget, and I think we've been discussing it so much today, is the question of governance and behavior, social behavior. Perhaps more important than The Wealth of Nations. The Wealth of Nations is a very, very powerful, very important book, no doubt. And it has this one idea has been pulled out from there about the invisible hand. But you have to see it as a pair. And the paired book is a theory of moral sentiments that he wrote. And the theory of moral sentiments, he's really talking about social behavior, human behavior in different situations. He's also talking about the prerequisites or the correlates which have to underpin the market. And so I think that part of it is really quite central, is really very, very important, and that's normally just not there. So what comes down from the Adam Smith Institute now is just that one idea which is picked up, if you see what I mean. So that's something which I wanted to give to you. Now that's one of the turnings, or one of the things whether there's a missed opportunity, or I think needs to be brought out much more. Okay, so just giving you an example of this. So we go back to the role of ideas, and so can economics, and if you do different economics, can it change things? Well, the two persons who agreed on this, and they were complete opposites and enemies in a way. They won't say opposites, but they were academic enemies and policy enemies, is Keynes and Hayek. Now, Friedrich Hayek was anti-Keynes, and he remains all the way through. He did not accept that the Keynesian system worked. He thought that unemployment was frictional in nature. He had also things which Samuelson later on said that he's a bit of a fool, and nobody thinks of him now anymore, and so on and so forth. So I think on the question of the macroeconomics, he was actually as described by Samuelson. I would not say it myself, but I think he was more or less there. But anyhow, there's something we'll come back from on Hayek. But both of them, Hayek and Keynes, both believed in the power of ideas. There are all these famous quotations from Keynes, that politicians are the victims of some defunct economist or some defunct theory and so on, which is actually very true. These days, we are all victims and subjected to the atrocities which come from austerity economics, which is not an economics that you can defend. And so this is now a good example of what Keynes was talking about. Hayek says that it will take, it's through ideas you change things. Now, in a way, they're both Hegelian. You can see almost that sort of an influence. But he says that it will take a cycle of 30 years before a new set of ideas can actually be brought into the mainstream discourse and become a force in society. So you have to hold your breath and work to disseminate those ideas everywhere. And it's not to do with academic journals, it's to do in public media, public fora. You have to simplify the ideas and tell them what it is. And this is where Hayek's idea of liberalism and his own idea from 1944, where he says, he describes what's happening in Europe, and of course the socialist economy there, obviously, but also even in Europe, he describes it as the road to serfdom. Now that road to serfdom is not China wasn't there, it wasn't socialist at that point in time, but it wasn't the Soviet Union. He was talking about Scandinavian and British welfare states. And this is actually quite remarkable. That's the road to serfdom. So now this is, but the role of ideas, they share. So I think we can, both sides share, so that's okay. I think Friedman also accepts this and shares this. So if that's the power of ideas, then how do we, and these are all the problems we still have, those ideas have clearly not worked in the last 50, 60 years. Now, what about Keynes's ideas himself? Did they work? And now Keynes, his theory comes up in 1936, his book. I'm sure many of you, but perhaps not all, will know that the Polish economist Michał Kalecki had actually preceded the general theory with his own work, which was published in 1933, but it was in Polish. Yeah, so, and it didn't register on people till quite some time. And even in Cambridge, it was very soon acknowledged that Kalecki's formulation of the macroeconomic problem of countries was actually more powerful and clearer than that of Keynes. And I think one of the reasons for that, to my mind, which I like, and the difference between the two, Keynesian economics runs purely in terms of aggregates. Savings, consumption is aggregated at the level of national income. If you take the Kaleckian framework, it's to do with workers' consumption, capitalist consumption, workers. And so you find actually some class elements, class categorizations, which is like it has a resonance to classical political economy where it was in terms of classes as categories, which is there in Kalecki. And I always wondered, why that framework was not fully adopted. The Keynesian framework wasn't fully converted by people like Richard Stone, who was the master of social accounting and social accounting matrices in Cambridge and was there and was himself a Keynesian. Why that wasn't picked up so that they could do the national accounts but do it then in terms of classes. Okay, imperfectly, but so. So I think now Keynes's ideas are picked up in the UK fully, and that's immediately from 1936, and then of course the war intervenes. But immediately in the post-war period, Keynesianism is everywhere, and of course that thing. We are all Keynesians now, that type of thing. So that's a period for the UK, and it occupies the classrooms, the books, the journals, policymakers, government, and so on. It's right across the board. Yeah, so that's from the 30s. Now, it's not so in the US. It's not so in the US, and you can ask why. In the UK, it's to do with the war and people coming back. And that's also the basis for the starting off of the welfare state. 1944, the year in which Hayek writes his The Road to Serfdom, is also the year in which William Beveridge writes the report on full employment in the UK. And that's in a way the start. It's also the year when you have an education law which is giving free education in the UK. So you can see here, in one case, it is going towards the welfare state and all these universalizations. And the other side is actually not at all going in that direction. Keynes could not persuade the politicians in the US about Keynesianism of this type at all. Now, in the UK, this, as I said, this took root and it was very powerful and it was sustained. Keynes himself died in 1946. So he was just too exhausted with the business of war and also in Bretton Woods, which I think put a lot of stress on him. Now, I have to say a word about Bretton Woods here, the institutions, which are, to my mind, became serious culprits and culpable for many of these crises that we're actually talking about, the IMF and the World Bank. These organizations, they were set up in 1944. Keynes was a participant in that whole thing. And allow me to just say one sentence, that the proposals that Keynes had were very different and they were rejected. They were not accepted. And they're not accepted because the Americans rejected them. And the proposal that he had in mind was something which would stabilize commodity prices. It would also stabilize international movements of capital, and also have a balance between the surplus and the deficit economies. There would be a sort of a new kind of a currency which would actually serve to help to stabilize the international monetary system. And Hans Singer later on made a distinction between Keynes 1 and Keynes 2. Keynes 1 of the multiplier, where you spend money and it goes around and it generates more employment and so on. That's Keynes 1, he said. He said, and the question which I'll come to, does that Keynes 1 multiplier give a solution to third world countries? You know, developing economies, you just spend money and it'll happen. So that was Keynes 1. And the other one was Keynes 2. And Keynes 2 was the propositions that he had for the Bretton Woods institutions. And he says, what if those had been accepted? And his argument is that if they had been accepted, he's making this argument in the 1980s, Hans Singer. He says if these arguments had been accepted, we would not see the kinds of financial crises and the crisis of commodity destabilization and of financial destabilization that we see in the world at that point in time. And this is in 1983. And some of the things which happened subsequently really makes you think about those things. And the answer goes back to the Americans actually saying no. And he couldn't, I mean, now there are other, Toy, John Toy, he's argued that, well, he wasn't thinking of the third world countries, he was thinking about protecting, about the commoditization package, protecting UK from, monopolization of grain exports and so on from the US and things like that. There are subtext there, but this is the main thing which is there. So there's already you have the idea of some neoliberal American liberalism coming in and opposing the Keynesian solutions at the international level. In the US itself, where again, troops were coming back, all the GIs, and Samuelson says that when all these GIs came back, the dean in Harvard said to him, look, we need to, they're coming out here to teach them something, write a textbook. Yeah, so he wrote a textbook. And he says they're all flooding in. Now, that textbook is the first edition of economics. It's not the foundations of economic analysis. It's not that. It's just the economics textbook. But before he had actually before his book was published, there was another book which was published on Keynesianism, Macroeconomics, by a person called Laurie Tarshis. Now, Tarshis was a direct student of Keynes in Cambridge. And he was completely a Cambridge economist in that way. He was a Keynesian. He wrote this book based on the direct lectures of Keynes and so on and so forth. And this book was all over the press. It was flying. He says, oh, I'm going to be a millionaire. And then the book reaches the neoliberals and the McCarthyites. And that book is suppressed. It is letters go out to all university departments. You cannot have it on the curriculum. it goes out, disappears, and Samuelson comes in its place. Yeah, so there is something here about the politics of, and the Americans are not keen on Keynesianism, and even the New Deal and so on, it wasn't really so. So I think so there's something along those lines for the Keynesian side. Now, let me take a step. So this is one side. I just want to take a step back into Cambridge. And this is a bit from the book I have, but also from my personal history. Yes, but if you take heterodox economics, then its home, really, you can argue with a lot of conviction, was Cambridge. It's from there that the seed and so on went out. Yeah, and now we know, but okay, Adam Smith, coming all the way down, you come into the, you have the master of neoclassical economics, Alfred Marshall, is a Cambridge man. He wrote his textbooks there. So Cambridge was known to be neoclassical through and through. At the same time, the London School of Economics at that time was a radical place. Yeah, now I'm mentioning this because the switch is very soon. It was a radical place. Why so? It was set up by the Webbs. And the Webbs were Fabian socialists. And they wanted economics for public purpose. Marshall said there is no such thing, economics for public purpose. It should be good economics. It should be analytically sound. It was positivist. You can use it for other things, but that value system has to be outside it. It's not the economics. And that same thing, taking values out of economics, has been the mainstream economics idea all the way through. Opposed to the heterodox economics from Cambridge, where people like Joan Robinson would regard value judgments as being of the essence of economics. You cannot escape them. It is full of value judgments. So this is one kind of a thing which comes up in Cambridge. At the time of 1920s, I want to pick up the story from there. 1926 is 1915, I think, okay, let me just simplify. I think time will run out. You have Marshall's chair, professorship, goes to Pigou. Now, Pigou he's a father figure for welfare economics. But he made a couple of other contributions which are very important. You see, and you can see how their welfare economics is now. He was also an individualist. So his economics is not a macroeconomics of the Cambridge type. It is based on the individual, welfare maximization and so on. So I focus on the individual, which is why Professor Sen, who is a specialist in capability analysis, also focusing on the individual, thinks that Pigou is really the most wonderful person almost in Cambridge economics, and he was ignored, and welfare economics was ignored. And Amartya was not allowed to teach welfare economics in Cambridge. That was his grouse with the Keynesians, by the way. They didn't let him teach economics in this way. But Pigou had this, and the other side of Pigou, apart from welfare economics, is his critique of the gross national product. So he wrote the national income, and if you want the most systematic treatment of national income and why it does not work as a measure of welfare, you have to read Pigou. So much later, Professor Sen and Professor Stiglitz and Professor Fitoussi, a French philosopher, were hired by the French president to again look at GDP and say GDP is not good. So they rediscovered all those arguments which they in Pigou, I think, and they published this report. And who was the French president? Is somebody in prison now? It was Sarkozy. Yeah? So it was the most unlikely combination of Sarkozy saying, you know, GDP should not be the point of emphasis and so on. So anyhow, that was Pigou's thing at that point in time. Pigou also came up in welfare economics with a very powerful idea, which I think runs all the way through economics if it's to be for public purpose. And that's the notion of externalities. And externalities, for those of you who are not economists, is a simple idea which says that if I'm an entrepreneur, I'm looking at my costs and my profits. I'm a profit maximizer. I see my prices which I give and the cost which I have to pay, and my margin is my profit. I want to maximize my profit. But supposing you are actually a weaver, not a weaver, but a dyer or something next to the river, and you put all the chemicals into the river, for me, it's not a cost. So it's gone. So for me, this is fine. I can keep doing that. But for people in the river, whether it's the fish or it's people, fishermen down, it is actually a negative cost. And that is a negative externality. And so he says that when you actually look at transactions in a market, the market actually is only looking at costs and profits, which are for the personal thing, and not at social costs and social benefits, which are always different from costs and private costs and benefits. That's the notion of externalities. And it's there very clearly in Pigou. and of course is there before Pigou. If you read Marshall carefully, it's also there in Marshall, who's a neoclassical, but he's not a fool. I mean, he's a very thinking person in that way. All right, so these are contributions which are coming from Pigou, and he's making a critique of neoclassical economics. Now, go from that to, this is 1915, you go from that to 1926. And then you have some very powerful interventions, two I mentioned to you. One is from Maynard Keynes, and he has a book in that year called The End of Laissez-Faire. The End of Laissez-Faire. It's a small book. It was given as lectures in Oxford, but converted into a book. And it is a complete frontal critique of laissez-faire capitalism as it is there in the UK. And he's also giving answers of governance about if it is to be replaced, it's not going to be the state. It's going to be multi-level governance structures which actually can handle different categories of transactions. He's also very careful about the limits of that kind of intervention, where the market should be allowed to do things, the individual should be allowed to do things. So that's, and he says it's passé. That's 1926, yeah? So, well, unfortunately it wasn't the case, but that's 26. The other situation, 1926, comes from Straffa. And Piero Straffa, Italian economist, a friend of, close associate of Antonio Gramsci, communist, I was in the college, I hardly ever saw him. A great man, brought all the Italians, they came in like bees to the, you know, and they also, so the whole school of around Straffa grew up, and Straffa had a very major critique of neoclassical economics, but that came in 1960 with his book. But in 1926, when he was a young person, he had just arrived in Cambridge, I think a year or two before that, he wrote a piece which was a critique of perfect competition. If I'm saying it's a critique of perfect competition, it's really talking about scale economies in industry and organization of industry. But effectively, it destroys the idea that you have perfect competition, it can work efficiency and so on. It destroys that idea. 1933, Joan Robinson writes a book on imperfect competition, basically saying there's no such thing as perfect competition, which is the heart of neoclassical economics. So if you put these things together, you have already very powerful critiques which are coming up that capitalism is not working. You know, it can't deliver its promises that it will be maximize the welfare of everybody, which was the proposition from the utilitarians. You ask everybody to follow their consumer preferences, and if they can do that and people can maximize profits, and I maximize my utility as a consumer, that's maximize the welfare of everybody in society. Sorry, no, won't happen. So this is now to do with the 1933, this bit which is going on. Another contribution here, which has to be noted, is from a person called Alan Young, an American economist. He was recruited into the London School of Economics by Beveridge. And he had a very short stay there, but he wrote a paper which was like a, what shall I say, a companion paper independently to the paper of Straffa. Again, it is to do with economic progress, the economies of scale. It's 1928. The two papers together effectively destroy the propositions of neoclassical economics. I mean, it wouldn't work after that. So these are critiques which are very powerful, which are there already. Now, I call these internal critiques of capitalism, which come from Cambridge. There's an internal critique which if you put together from Pigou and from Joan Robinson about imperfect competition, and from Alan Young, although he was like a Cambridge economist, but also from Straffa. These are critiques of the premises of neoclassical economics and also about the aspect of efficiency of the system as it was. They were looking for reforms. They were looking for reforms. You know, it shouldn't be monopolistic, it shouldn't be this, shouldn't be that. Okay, that's one side. Then comes the whole idea of Keynes. And the Keynesian critique, as you know, is one which is of the macro system. And the macro system is looking at stabilization. The economy is not stable. How do you guarantee stability? That's a critique. There are other critiques, which are Marxist critiques. Maurice Dobb is there. Then there are critiques which are coming from the now independent colonies, which is a new branch of critique, which is development economics, which is saying we don't want this system. Market doesn't work. There are too many shortfalls. And so we need the role of the state comes in a big way. Whether you think it from Gershengorn or whether you take it from somewhere else, the role of the state becomes central in this whole proposition. In between, of course, there's the Soviet Union, and that's a socialist critique, systemic. Capitalism is exploitative. We want a different system. So you get these three powerful critiques: internal capitalist critique, you get an external socialist critique, and you get an external development non-capitalist critique. And the non-capitalists included many countries, including our own, and Yugoslavia, and all those, that block of countries was looking for a non-capitalist path. India called it socialistic, somebody else called it something else. The idea was you would combine state and market in some way and make it more egalitarian, make it more efficient, state-driven, have higher rates of savings and accumulations. These are the kind of things. Now, so these are happening in the 50s is the last one, 1920s, 30s is the Soviet Union, China is also 1950s. In between 1920s, 30s, and 40s is the internal critique. Now, what happens to all these? They're all evolving, developing, and neoclassical economics is nowhere in Cambridge, really, except in the persona of a few people. And then you find between 1980 and 1990, effectively, all these three major oppositional projects, they all collapse. 1990, Soviet Union, gone. 1978, China turns reformist, goes the other way. 1973 is the end of the development agenda, in my view. That is the turning point for development economics. I'll say a word about that in a second, about the oil price. I think the significance of that is not fully acknowledged in this thing. And of course, the whole business about, I told you, Apigu and so on is swept under the carpet. So all these collapse, and what comes back? What comes back is the default option, the new avatar of mainstream economics. Mainstream economics, which people like in the Western, in the Cambridge, in the US, was evolving along the lines of general equilibrium and rational expectations and other kinds of things, which were becoming a mathematical version of a reality which didn't exist. There were models of a reality, but the models had no bearing with the reality when you went out and you actually tried to test it. So they become an exercise in themselves. And so there are these fights between the two Cambridges for quite some time. I won't go into all this, but you have therefore the arrival again of neoclassical economics, but now this time it has got wiped out by this time in the US, in the UK as well. That's the story of my book, Fat Book. How did these heterodox traditions, which were in Cambridge, and they were so powerful and so entrenched in minds, and how did they disappear in 10 or 15 years? And that complex story, people have said, they used to fight with each other, all these heterodox economists, they were all prima donnas, they couldn't get along and all the rest of it. But I think that there was a very big influence, not just of the internal fights, that's true, internal demography, internal fights, internal retirements, but the real thing in the face of which it collapsed was the onslaught which came from the outside in the form of neoliberal tendencies and neoliberal forces, and also American opposition which came across the Atlantic, challenging this and suppressing this. And that's a story which is there in the book if you're interested. There is the link will be available, I think, and so on, and you can follow up that story there. I don't want to take that story further into this, except to say that it's most important to look at the role of these external forces of neoliberalism, which then destroyed and brought down heterodox economics right across the board. This is where neoliberalism enters the picture. I go back to the 1973 for a minute. You have the oil price hikes, 1973, 1979. You get a massive debt crisis in the third world. All the big money, OPEC money, goes into Paris and into New York. Those banks are flush with money. They have to lend it out, make money on money. And governments are very happy to borrow money, and they can't pay it back. And they spend, therefore, there's profligacy. And I was just mentioning to colleagues at lunchtime, Francis Stewart's phrase, money irresponsibly lent and irresponsibly taken, borrowed. And so it was a marriage made in hell for this guarantee to. So the debt crisis is there. And with the debt crisis comes the Bretton Woods institutions, this time not as saviors, the way that Keynes was talking about for third world commoditization problems and imbalance problems. It comes in the form of a moneylender. So the IMF is the last resort moneylender, and they behave like moneylenders because they come with conditionality. And if I think of my village in India, and the moneylender comes in, he says, oh, I'll have these utensils are collateral, this, that, the other, your wife will work on my farm, this will happen, that will happen, and so on. If you don't pay back, this will happen, so on. This is what you have to do to get money from me, and things are done. Well, that's exactly what happened with the World Bank, and I don't know, 100 countries or whatever, where all the little boys and girls came with their little toolkit, which they all were issued. It was an identical toolkit, how to do structural adjustment, how to do stabilization, and went country by country to actually impose austerity and impose these transition rules, which I think were very, very hostile to development and ended the development project for quite a while. I think many of those problems are there from this time. The aspirations of the third world were industrialization along Caldorian lines. We want to industrialize, catch up, like Lewis was mentioned. The whole idea was that as industrialization takes place, surplus labor will be absorbed and productivity will rise, agriculture will get modernized, and that's the road to a modern economy. Well, it never really happened. Apart from East Asian countries, 3 of them, none of them actually managed to draw the labor away till such time as the wage rate would begin to rise. None of them. So we have surplus labor issues in our rural sectors everywhere, and at the same time, employment is not absorbed, and we have technological changes coming up in the past and coming up, which more or less guarantee that your ability to absorb labor force, even with very high growth rates, India is 6-7%, unemployment is actually mounting still. So it's not making a dent on surplus labor. So that's kind of a crisis which comes up from these sorts of issues. So, and I think these problems have persisted from the 1970s onwards in one form or another, along with juxtapositions of crises on top of all this. So I do not think that mainstream economics has actually performed any public purpose. It has stood in the way of public purpose. It does not have any solutions. The solutions offers are paper solutions for paper problems, but for real life problems, there isn't really a solution that they have. And many of them which are there are, again, corporatized, profit maximizing, profit helping solution, like, whether you want to do, how do you handle carbon and so on. It's a problem area. On finance, the London School of Economics, which I mentioned to you, by the way, as being a leftist place in the it was set up in 1900, whereas Cambridge was right-wing, in economics, Marshall, and so on. Then you find that Marshall is gone, the Cambridge radicals have come up, all these heterodox people I mentioned to you. In LSE, what happens is that you have, on the webs and all this thing, it's Hugh Dalton is the person running it, and Beveridge. Now, you get the position for replacing Hugh Dalton, and the person who's asked is Jacob Weiner, a real trade, neoclassical economist. He refuses, and it goes to Alan Young. Alan Young is really like a Cambridge Keynesian sitting in the LSE, and he was the teacher to people like Kaldor and a whole range of people, Lava Lerner and so on. And there's a book on his teachings and how he was, and it's thought to be really a wonderful thing. I can imagine all that. Now, Alan Young, Lionel Robbins is also at the London School of Economics. He says himself he's in love with Vienna, and Viennese in Austrian economics. He's absolutely hostile to Keynes and Keynesian economics, and he wants to destroy it if he can, but he can't. There's Alan Young. Now, both of them get bitten, and they get influenza, I think 4 or 5 times. Sue Howson's book on Lionel Robbins says that he got about 5 or 6 times. Nothing happened to him. Alan Young, who had just arrived a year and a half earlier, he got it once, and within days he died. So that was the end of the Alan Young story about London School of Economics having a track. And he was only 52. He could have been there for a long while. And LSE could have gone a very different track, but Lionel Robbins takes over, and he brings in Hayek into London School of Economics. And from there, Hayek actually goes on to Chicago, where he wasn't part of the Friedmanite thing. They wouldn't have him in there, Knight and so on, but he was outside it. But that's where there's a massive force of American philanthropy from the corporate sector, which through the NGOs and through their advocacy institutes and their propaganda institutes, is a forum for educational, economic education. They create the ones also in the UK. They influence these, and they give the money for setting these things up. And that's where the Institute of Economic Affairs starts, which is the one which actually supports Thatcher. And so that's the kind of a drift which happens, and that's the force. Friedman is an acolyte of Hayek to begin with, although they fell out later. And Hayek starts off his Mont Pelerin Society, based on Mont Pelerin, which is outside Lausanne in Switzerland. And this is in 1947. And the idea is in 30 years, you will be able to destroy Keynesianism and you'll have neoliberal policies taking over everywhere, which is roughly what happens. And so this movement of theirs, they spreads all over the world, they have regular meetings and so on, becomes an advocacy movement. Now, Friedman is part of it. Hayek says, I've had enough, it's not working, I'm going to stop it. This is in 1972. And then in 1974, Hayek is given the Nobel Prize. And the Nobel Prize is given to all the presidents of the Mont Pelerin Society. The people who are in the committee who are giving the Nobel Prizes have a domination of Mont Pelerin members. This is in Sweden. The Swedish committee is actually wanting to oppose local democratic, other kinds of groups. And of course, Nobel's family, Alfred Nobel's family, is opposed to this prize. So their name is not attached directly to the prize. They refuse to have their name attached to that prize. But that's the background to it. And this is now the branding of the message, which comes from Hayek. And that branding of message is then weaponized, and it's weaponized through the American Reagan-Thatcher thing. And it reaches this high point with Chile. But the Chileans say that, Maggie Thatcher started all this in 1979 because she came in on the bulk of the inflation which was happening in the UK after the oil price hikes and the trade union actions. And the Chileans say, sorry, we started it in Chile in 1975. And that's which came through from the Chicago school people who came in and advising, running 150 PhD students and this and that. So that's the kind of a pressure which you have coming in from this, what I've called the worldwide web of the neoliberal thought collective. That term is not mine, it's from Mirovsky and Plevey, their book, they call it. And I think that's a very good formation, because people say, who's a neoliberal and who's this? It's a thought collective, and the collective is actually very wide-ranging, just as heterodox was very wide-ranging and neoclassical is very wide-ranging. But this wide-ranging thing should not be allowed to make you think that they have different policies. Samuelson laughed and was hostile to Friedman, dismissed monetarism. He was hostile to Hayek. Hayek was dismissive of general equilibrium, which Paul Samuelson and co were doing. He said you have to know knowledge in society. It was not his model at all. Friedman and Samuelson, they didn't get along either, and Friedman and Hayek had a fight as well later on. So they didn't, but Applebaum, in a recent book on the economics profession, says that a big survey was done of economists right across the US, and they found that between 90 and 95% of the 97% of the economists all agree on the policy steps of wage control, of free exchange rates, and all the policy issues on which are mainstream policy issues. So you can have your fights on this and the other. When it comes to what you have to do in the world, you're all at one. So I think I would say, because I think the rest has to happen when we have a chat about this, I would say that you found from the weaknesses of that capitalist system and the theories which were legitimizing it, you have the growth of oppositional projects, both in reality and in theory, and the ones in reality collapse. And when they collapse in reality, as I mentioned, the three projects, you find that the theories which are associated with it are discredited. Those people can't get jobs, they're wiped out, and the profession becomes essentially mainstream, run from the US, all those markets, and it purifies itself. Social sciences go out, applied work goes out, and so on. So you get that kind of an economics, and that's then what dominates the subject. And but the default option is a new avatar of the free market economy, and this time it's now on steroids, because you have financialization, you have these other kinds of crises which you have. Technology has moved on a great deal, and American domination now is at a different level from the time when we are talking about Keynes in the post-war sort of era. It's very different from there. So I think I'd better stop there, because I could expand this, but I think the rest has to be from people asking questions and so on. So I would say that there were, and you can see many a point where you could take a different track in the subject, but those tracks were either shut off in one way or the other, and we're left with the main avenue, and that main avenue is going nowhere.
Ashwani, thank you very, very much for this extremely rich talk. You have taken us in a long voyage trip with the economics science. And in fact, you have traced the history of development in the development of economic science. And you have mentioned, I had mentioned a few names, as you said, structuralists, dependentistas, but you have mentioned names closely associated with the development of economic science. You have mentioned Samuelson, you have mentioned John Robinson, Pigou, Amartya Sen, Straffa, but what the name that came back once and again in your talk is Keynes. John Maynard Keynes, and of course Adam Smith. So, and you were keen on stressing that Adam Smith is not only the wealth of nations. So, and you mentioned social behavior. Do I understand by that you wanted to say that Adam Smith was not only concerned with economic growth, he was concerned with other aspects of societal change that we have come in the last few decades to associate with development, when we stopped considering that development is mere growth, and we said that it's about changes in the structures of the economy, and then changes in the structure of society and of culture, and then changes in the structure of political systems, and the concept of development kept expanding. To understand that, you want to say, in a way, that Adam Smith launched the ball of economic development, without probably saying that, without using the term. And do you also want to say that, in a way, Keynes was setting the foundations with his ideas of development, that if his ideas for the Bretton Woods institutions had been adopted, we would not have had the crisis of the 1970s and 1980s, which means that underdeveloped countries would have developed without hitting the crisis that they came to hit, meaning that they could have developed without hitting this crisis. Is my understanding correct? It may be completely wrong, by the way, but if I understand it correct, and of course I'll give you the floor. So, please.
I think it's very, very canny. Let's see if that is a banana skin. Okay, Adam Smith. There's something else also, by the way, on Adam Smith, I would say, which this reading of Adam Smith, I think, is most important. And I remember Martha Sen saying in a lecture when he was my teacher at Delhi School of Economics that most of the people who actually talk about Adam Smith or Ricardo, they haven't read the original works. And I think he's absolutely right. We think, oh, Adam Smith, oh, the invisible hand. You know, my God, I mean, invisible hand is like sort of, you know, reducing a complex statement down to this. Now, by the way, Adam Smith did believe that this capitalist development would eventually deliver well-being and goodness to everybody. Now, goodness I'll take back, because the theory of moral sentiments actually is a challenge to that notion. But employment, economic well-being to everybody. Because he says, in due course, the economy will grow and labor will also begin to benefit. Real wages will rise. And incidentally, that was also linked to the idea of the markets, and that was linked to the idea of colonies. Also very much there. So all of them used to have the habit of saying, what's the population of China? And you said 250 million. If all the people bought 3 yards of cloth, you know, in a month, then that would be so many million yards of cloth. And for the year, it would be so many billion yards of cloth. And my God, what would happen to profits and to industry in Manchester? So they used to have dreams of that kind. But he did believe that there was a harmonious relationship between the working class and the capitalist class in the process of development, that harmonious development would be delivered by the system. He believed that. At the same time, he felt, I'll give you 2 qualifications in this. One, that he was also, if you want to think in development terms, a positive wage theorist. He said that if actually people's well-being, the workers' welfare is looked after, productivity will rise. Now, these are ideas that economists will attribute to Liebenstein and so on when it comes up much, much later. But this is something which is there in Adam Smith. So he's making a plea that you should not be thinking of labor as purely as a cost. You should be thinking of it as a person who can actually contribute to productivity. But for that, the person has to be in the system in that way. Education is my this thing. He also says that there has to be a certain minimum level of consumption for the working class, because that should be something which should be like in a social norm. They shouldn't be at a level which actually does not have dignity for them. So their dignity has to be protected. Now, these are statements they make. Nobody else, the others don't. The others all sort of market clearance and, you know, whatever else. So you come down to 1844, I mean, all there is this. So this is here. Now, another proposition he says that this division of labor is productive, but it involves repetitive work. And repetitive work, later on, you find from Noam Chomsky and others picking on the same thing, that you're creating automatons. And this is now, like in modern times, Charlie Chaplin, you know, you're converting human beings into appendages of machines. You know, just, I'm a Charlie Chaplin, but my hand has always a spanner, and you're just fixing spanner things. So now these are very progressive ideas about the nature of the working class and what. So although he says that in the long run there'll be a harmonious interest, he has all these other things which you have to pull out. So now your question is actually you hit the nail on the head. You say, should we regard him as a sort of a father figure also for development economics? And I think yes. I think yes. He's also an economist from the periphery. You know, he's Scots. And Scotland is a periphery at point in time. So his angle of viewing UK development and all the rest of it is very much from that perspective. You can also see things of that kind. Just to mention one thing which I skipped over in this thing is of course, David Ricardo, who's theoretically very powerful. And he also believes, he takes over the proposition from Adam Smith that in his first edition, that this is a harmonious relationship between working class and capitalist class. In his second edition, which is 1815, in his preface to the second edition, he says, I have now considered what is happening in terms of the replacement of human labor by machines. That's also the time Luddites and everything else are around. And he says, this shows to me that the interests of the working class and the interests of the capitalist class are irreconcilably opposed. So there goes out of the window the idea of Adam Smith that it's going to be a harmonious system. And this is something that Marx picks up with great, I mean, he challenges Ricardo on the idea that there'll be market clearance and his version of the labor theory of value and so on. But when it comes to this particular insight, which is a very radical, very powerful, and for an economist of that stature to stand up, and he was in the stock market, and so no, he was not a trade union leader, and this is what he says. You see, and now this is so these are observations which come from that side, which are extremely powerful, but they're actually they're just dismissed and overlooked. Keynes was, of course, the whole idea was that he said that people are not absorbed into employment for lack of investment, and the lack of investment is because, very rationally, you know, that he had notion of the liquidity preference, a certain kind of a use of money, which takes money, withdraws money from circulation in certain situations, and so there'll be unemployment. Marx has a different theory of unemployment. He says the capitalist system guarantees, makes sure that actually people are unemployed because we're not going to discipline them. So the lumpenproletariat, the size, and the unemployed force is related to that. So there are different kinds of ideas. Keynes's idea is this, and so, but Keynesian economics has come through, I have to say, there's Keynes of one kind or another, and it is worth not thinking of Keynes like Adam Smith. There's also something to be, you have to go to the next level of disaggregation in terms of Keynes. This is the simplest idea. Though Keynes says it's because of this reason that you have unemployment, and if you were to spend money, if people are not spending the money, the government steps in to spend money. This is a short-term situation. You have a crisis of unemployment. This is because money is not being spent. This also happened in the US. And so you now spend money. And when you spend money on something, you get the money. And you get the money, you spend it, you get the money. And so the money multiplies, the demand, and that's the multiplier. If you spend $1, how many dollars of demand will actually emerge at the end of the day? Oh, you know, it depends how quickly it circulates and all the rest of it. So it's a multiplier which is at work. Now, the other side says, yeah, if you keep spending money, you think you can, but as soon as you get towards full employment, workers will demand more wages. And when they demand more wages, the cost of production will go up everywhere, the prices will go up, there'll be inflation. So this is the origin of the whole idea that somehow it will cause inflation. But so what if it causes some inflation? You know, I think Richard is making this sort of argument also about, you know, there's austerity economics, and where you say, oh, somehow you have to balance the book. This balancing of the book is a very neoliberal, neoclassical, not even neoliberal notion, if I may say so. It's orthodoxy at its extreme. There's no reason for it to happen. And a certain degree of inflation in the economy actually is probably a good thing. You know, so I think that's the kind of a thing which happens with Keynes. So that's one point in Keynes. The other thing about Keynes, I think also to be noted there, is that this is a short-run theory. And the work of people like Joan Robinson and others in Cambridge was, can we convert this into a long-run theory, a long-run system for growth with employment, full employment? Under what conditions can that happen? And so Joan Robinson's work, her accumulation of capital, her famous work, is actually trying to extend the Keynesian idea into a growth model in which employment would be ensured. So this is the kind of a thing which is very often overlooked. Kalecki is a very powerful figure who sits on top of all of this, very close to Joan Robinson later. The other person who dismisses this to some extent, not that he's not a Keynesian, he's thoroughbred Keynesian, Nicky Kaldor. Nicky Kaldor was in LSE. He came to Cambridge. He was Frank Hahn, who's in my book one of the villains, neoclassical par excellence, a father figure of a neoclassicism in the UK. Frank Hahn was a supervisee in London. And then after one or two terms, he falls out and he's supervised by Lionel Robbins, who's anti-Keynesian and so on and so forth. But they remain together and so on. Now, Kaldor, his idea is industrialization. And here, if you'll allow me a minute, I think you'll see that'll be a minute, maybe hopefully well spent. Kaldor believes that without industrialization, you cannot have increasing productivity, higher growth without inflation. And in order to be able to do that, it has to also be export-oriented. This is also another thing. But just using devaluation and exchange rate is not going to work, because the problems are very much to do with the nature of the structural constraints in the industrial sector and in the economy. So industrial policy, economic policy across the board, which is developmental in nature, is required for the UK. He's talking about the UK. We are talking about the 60s here. And you need protection, because British industry is not able to compete at this point in time with industrial imports coming in from outside. I was there at this point in time in Cambridge, and all this. And you look at that whole agenda of policy, it is a blueprint of an agenda of having protection, industrialization behind protection, yeah, with industrial policy for infrastructure and for having a wage agreement with the workers based on productivity. Now, this is a development, he's a development thinker, which is why he is also the key person who inspires development thinking, for instance, for Ajit Singh, who's again pure industrialization and so on. East Asian models, all those, which are the same, export-led industrialization in this way. Now, he is talking about the real economy, and he's talking about economies of scale. So there's a very clear link there between this Adam Smith propositions, which I mentioned, Alan Young and Piero Straffa, 1926 and 1928, those papers of economies of scale, and Kaldor, who's using economies of scale as a key basis for economic growth, manufacturing revival, and it's within a policy treating the UK economy as an underdeveloped economy. So there is a blending here of the lines of thinking between development economics. So the idea you're rich and we are poor is not the point. The point is, what is the problem of economy? And unemployment is the big issue at that time. So many of the problems at that time were being dealt with in Cambridge in these sort of traditions, but these are all the ones which get wiped out.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. This is, I don't know, it's a coincidence, but I've been looking and thinking about these things for some time now, and I love the fact that I got to talk to you and listen to you. So I've been thinking about the question about what makes an economic theory heterodox. And I was trying to, on the basis of your account of the heterodoxy in Cambridge, to actually come up with an answer to the question about how do I, pinpoint and I found out that so far, and I want to check what you think about this, that it has to do with the critique of the individualist assumption of neoclassical economics, both as a methodological starting point, but also as a normative ideal. And in that sense, the minute we disrupt the methodological individualism and the normative individualism in economic theory, then we started opening possibilities about different ways of understanding what is a market, how do we understand the relationship between individuals in the market, and how do markets actually are arranged and connect with each other. But I wanted to ask, in your theory or in your account of heterodoxy, there is a missing path, which is the old institutionalist of Veblen and Commons, which is mainly US-based, dealing with the US problems. And it's very much about the critique of individualism, because it's not, the starting point is not the individual, but the relationships between individuals. But also it's about the role of institutions in shaping our preferences and determining what is rational for us at a particular moment. And for me, this becomes very crucial, because for them, especially Commons, the legal foundations of capitalism, a market is simply a complicated arrangements of contracts and property. The legal arrangements are actually what define the bargaining power of individuals, and then their bargaining determine the distribution of income in society. So how do the institutionalists fit in your understanding of the heterodoxy, especially that the critique of the institutionalists in the US came with Ronald Coase, Ronald Coase, whose problem of social cost is a critique of Pigou, ultimately, the problem of externalities. And so the whole redefining of the state as an institution that can be understood through individualist lens, started somehow as a process of reversal that changed a lot of the policies. How do you understand competition law? How do you understand intellectual property law? How do you understand torts and how you distribute compensation, etc.? So how does the old institutionalist fit in the narrative of heterodoxy and neoliberalism as actually a way of displacing the old with the new? Thank you.
Thank you. And we'll take so yes, I'll come this way. First, Dr. Mustafa Saith and Dr. Mariangela, and then we'll move here. Yes. I saw Richard as well.
Thank you very much for this talk, which traces the origins, in fact, of economics, not of development economics. Because, in fact, most of the names you suggested are not really concerned about development. They might be concerned about growth, but not development. Also, in this respect, I think a large part of your talk about, an institutional history of economics. You talked about the contribution of Cambridge, London School of Economics, but even in this framework, I think one institution was very important, really, in development economics, which is the Institute of Development Studies at Sussex. And I think it played a very important role in really, elaborating development economics. But taking all these together, I would call these, this is really imperialist economics. All these names are coming from UK, United States, maybe Italy. But I mean, later on, they were joined by someone like Amartya Sen. But I mean, this is really, this is the imperialist science. But it is imperialist in another sense. It completely ignores the contributions of other social sciences, which made development economics relevant when economists started to borrow from sociology, political science, anthropology. Development economics became relevant when the notion of a developmental state was introduced, because in fact, development economics does not answer the question, why does development succeed in one country and does not succeed in another country? And then the notion of a developmental state was discovered, and it came from a political scientist called Chalmers Johnson, who studied the history of Japan. Also, development economics became relevant when it borrowed the notion of social institution. Institution came from, I don't know, law, political science, sociology, and therefore it became a very important branch of economics, institutional economics. It became also relevant when it borrowed the notion of social capital. So in fact, the most interesting part of development economics now comes from other disciplines, not from economics. And without borrowing from these other disciplines, I think development economics would have continued to be irrelevant. So in this sense, I think it's imperialist in two senses. I would like also to say that your talk was mainly about mainstream economics. Some people would call it bourgeois economics, because there are important contributions by Marx and by Marxists. The analysis by Marx of the economic crisis is still very relevant. And then, other Marx like Paul Sweezy and Paul Baran, I think their contribution to development economics is fantastic. So these were neglected. I'm not going to talk about dependency school because, I don't know, economists look at dependency school with some sort of, arrogance. It's not relevant. So I think, if we like to have a talk about the history of development economics, we should be concerned really with economists who focused on development, not growth, not other philosophical issues. And we should also integrate the contribution of Marxism, dependency, and the contribution of other sciences. I think what you discussed was mainly history of the notion. Maybe you did not even focus on the notion of growth, which is closer. It's not development. Growth is not development. But I think part of your talk may be related to the notion of growth. So I think I benefit very much from tracing the origin of certain economics ideas, the contribution of major economists. But I'm afraid to say you said very little about development economics.
And you're talking about development without economics.
Well, development of development theory, this is about development, yeah.
Maria Angela?
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed I think that now it's good. I really appreciate especially the discussion on the intention that Keynes really had in terms of the Bretton Woods institutions and the stability that he saw, including in different areas, the monetary system and also commodities. I think I had a little bit of a similar reaction to you because, I mean, I took development economics in the New School, and my professor was Lance Taylor. And I was trying to remember his table of development economics and trying to think about the big names that I have been used to, like Arthur Lewis and the dual model, Chenery, Hirschman. We have talked about Prebisch and Singer a lot here, but there are others that came to my mind. And here I just kind of look quickly of the origin of this. And it is really the distinction between people that think about growth away from the international system. Like there are many of the ones that you mentioned, like Stiglitz. Stiglitz would talk about development now, but in his frame of mind, he doesn't think that about the distinctions for countries that have the dollar or don't have the dollar. That's a main distinction. It's closed economies, growth, at least as far as I can remember right now. So I think there is a big distinction between the two when we're trying to think. That doesn't mean that obviously the most influential theories that we have had are clearly the ones that you were mentioning from Adam Smith to now. But I was a little bit surprised and I just wanted to ask you about that. Like, what do you think about, first of all, Lance Taylor, who passed away 2 years ago, and his contributions in Latin America with practical process, like Chenery, Arthur Lewis, and all of this in your narrative. Where do they fit? How do you see them in this path? Thank you.
Ashwani, the floor. No, we'll get to the second round, but try. Yeah, to give, and then we'll go here.
So I think there were some questions about the institutions and so on. I accept that. I think my focus, and also there's also partly an answer to the unhappiness from Mustafa and Maria Angela about what is left out. You also have the same thing, what's left out. My concern here, my storyline here was focused on the epicenter of heterodox economics and how that changed. And I think Cambridge was the home of it. It was the original habitat, and it also was the last bastion where it was destroyed. So that was the kind of focus about. And I think the influence of what I call the neoliberal thought collective and the global web of it was focused very much on cleaning out that whole area of heterodox economics. That's the reason why I stayed with the kinds of traditions and the schools which were dominant there in terms of promoting heterodox economics. Now, that said, I think the persons who would be very open to the idea of Veblen institutionalism, heterodox, as different as from each other as also neoliberals and neoclassicals, there are big differences between them. Not so much divisions, but differences, because they all combine in the name of the enemy, in the face of the enemy, which is neoclassicism in that way. Now, I think it would be Joan Robinson. Joan would be very open. She was very, very open to other ideas, also to psychology, about how tastes and preferences are formed, how institutions work, how trade unions work. Many of them worked with it. Now, another name which I mentioned, which is rather more powerful than many of the others, American names you mentioned, is Morris Dobb. Morris Dobb is absolutely a first-rate thinker on the evolution of a capitalist economy. So if you're moving from small towns into a modern capitalist economy, going across the area which Engels is writing, working class in 1844, and the condition that Dickensian things, and they become a modern economy, if that isn't development, I don't know what is. But it's a development in the first industrial economy. But that's a process of development. Of course, we are talking about development in the sense of it's happening elsewhere, but there's also a notion of what constitutes development. And that's what I brought in from Adam Smith. What constitutes development also goes to the question of the conditions of the workers, also to do with the working class and otherwise. And you bring in the idea from Smith that they are conflict of distributional conflict. And when it comes to the Keynesians, they are, as I said, they don't deal with workers and capitalists. And I was saying that they could have done it with Stone, have a social accounting matrix with it. But there is something work of that kind in Cambridge at the time. But really, for them, the distributional question is handled through employment. There's a working class and there's a capitalist class. And the workers actually there's unemployment and there's low wages. And the question then is, how do you absorb the working class into good employment, in formal modern employment? So for them, employment is a proxy, really, for what would be well-being coming out from this thing. So that's the idea. The same thing is there for Lewis. And Lewis has a lot of issues and a lot of problems with Lewis in his formulation. He's too much an economist. The idea that he does not, he should have. I can say something else in a minute about. So that's I think you're right. Veblen, I think, is an important figure, but there are so are many others. So many others. I would agree that. IDS. IDS is a neo-colonial origins. IDS got its money, all of it, from the Overseas Development Organization in the UK. Dudley Sears more or less set it up. He was there at the ministry all the time, getting grants and money for doing the work, maintaining the staff of IDS. They had a certain view of development, and it wasn't a bad view. When Dudley Sears writes about what is development, it's a good piece. He has some very good pieces. He has a very powerful critique of the application of Keynesian categories, capitalist economy categories, to a developing country situation. He says those things are all different. So he has a critique of the special case. He says you can't. So now if everything is a special case, this is the problem with his approach. If every economy is a special case, then you don't have a theory. It just becomes empirical observations. You go in as a consultant and you do something or the other. And this is pointed out by a lot of people, including people from his own group. John Toy, who was the director of IDS later, has also pointed it out, and that's very clear. But he was, his heart was in development, but it was very much foreign aid type of development. So that's, I think, I wouldn't say much more than that. And IDS, I think, is still a consultancy shop. They're very good people there. They write a lot of good papers. I have no question about this. But the development studies, which is the development approach which is followed there, is essentially handling, because they do the consultancy work, essentially, is aid-dependent, aid-using projects. And that's the heart of the matter in their thing. And the other things as well. They have a disproportionate influence on thinking and on the terms of the discourse, precisely because its ideas has its history. So I have good things to say about IDS, but I will not accept it as being a major institute. It was major as a major player, but it didn't make it a major player in terms of thinking. I think at that time, a lot of thinking and development was coming from elsewhere. And you mentioned, where are the others? I had here the question of India and Cambridge in India. I think, if I may say so, as an Indian, I think the major contributions in development at that point in time came very profoundly from India. And go back a long way. But I mean, that's, I think I should give the reference of the book because then some of the questions will be answered. And the ones which are not, I think we'll deal with either on the next trip or by email. I think the thing about other branches, I wouldn't say that because the work is done by all people from the north that they are I wouldn't use the word imperialist. I think that's not appropriate in my book. Morris Dobb, how do you call him an imperialist? Joan Robinson, how do you call them imperialists? Or Keynes. Keynes actually was an imperialist. He didn't want independence and so on for India. He stood in the way of being able to correct the drain from India with an exchange rate policy which was against the Indian economy, which took in money. So I think Keynes is a bit different. So when we are thinking about what Hans Singer says, Keynes 2, which is the Bretton Woods Keynes, John Toy is right in saying that Keynes does not have necessarily the interests of third world countries in mind. And there are some very powerful papers, especially one by Amir Bagchi, Indian Marxist economist, who's gone into this in detail and has critiqued Keynes also about this, but has recognized also the power of Keynes's overall arrangement internationally, how that would be beneficial in this. Now, Keynes 1, Keynes 2, I should just mention that the Keynes 1 idea is that basically it does a multiplier work in the third world country. And this was a major debate. Does Keynesianism work in the third world? Can you just have, say, print money, and that was the idea, print money and spend it in the UK, I mean, in an underdeveloped situation, 30s. Can you do that in India? If you could do that, all you have to do is print money and you get development. But the counter question is, why not? Why not? And the only answer that would come up is, it'll lead to inflation because there's supply side constraints. And the answer comes from V.K.R.V. Rao, who's also a Cambridge man. Yeah? So there's a constraint there. But so Keynes, I think I'm using the word imperialist for all because they're from the Northwest. I don't think so. If you see the school of people who went to India in the 1950s and 60s, they are powerfully in support of the Indian planning exercise. There are many others who come from the US who actually are right-wingers. They are marketeers. Not all of them. I mean, Kuznets comes in there as well to this. But you have Richard Goodwin, who makes the first input-output table for India. Now, that's not quite, it's a structuralist proposition. Kaldor is there doing the tax reform, saying there should be an expenditure tax on luxuries and so on. That's not to be overlooked. Joan Robinson is there wanting land reform in a very big way, can't be overlooked. Stone is there to advise on the setting up of the national income framework. So all these contributions are there. And of course, Indians come back. So I think there is a lot there, but I wouldn't sweep them away in quite this way. Social sciences, yes. I think I have to mention here, I'll take the example of Brian Redaway, who is the applied economist, Keynesian, thought to be one of the best economists that Cambridge produced, applied economists. He understood theory backwards. People say that the best review of Keynes's book was by Redaway when he was just soon after he was actually finished being a student. He has a critique like Keynes of econometrics. He doesn't believe in this regression and econometrics because he thinks that methodology is such that it's actually freezing out things which actually all the time in motion in society. And without being a sociologist, this is what he's talking about. He's talking about social influences, psychological influences, infrastructural aspects, historical, many other things which you're just controlling by saying, oh, they are gone. We just look at this. So there is that sort of a critique, which is also there amongst the others. Calder doesn't do any econometrics. Joan refuses to do it. And because part of their perspective is that we are really looking at those aspects which are subject to what you would call the laws or the variables in which you can make sensible economics, which is the reason why heterodox economics of that kind always has open ends in it. It has open ends in it. It's not a closed system. I mean, where's the room for an entrepreneur in neoclassical economics? Everything is the entrepreneur, profit maximization. But tell me, if it's going to happen automatically, you move. Where is the entrepreneur in it? It only comes with Schumpeter. It doesn't come in neoclassical economics. There is no entrepreneur. You achieve general equilibrium, tautonyma, where's the entrepreneur? So I think the problems lie in neoclassicism, where every other subject is taken out. And the only thing that's left is somebody who has utility in their minds. They know what is utility, and I have to maximize that, this notion. That's the Benthamite and so on. So I think that social science is not explicitly there in the works of these people, but it's very amenable to being absorbed and to be given credit. And don't forget that for Joan Brown's famous paper, History versus Equilibrium, for the question of time and history was absolutely central in the exposition of Joan Robinson and Kaldor, and also right away all these people. Whereas history doesn't figure, it doesn't exist. The neoclassical economy is afloat, free of time. So I think that, so bourgeois, yes, I think that is, again, the same thing about imperialists and so on. Growth and development, I was using the example really of, I said to you about the socialist economies, that project failed or collapsed or failed. China didn't collapse or fail. Soviet Union did. India and all these other countries that we are talking about, their experience in development, they were focusing on development and structural change, industrialization. They weren't talking just about growth. So I won't fully accept that. So I think, let's say this, what was the other, Lance Taylor, Arthur Lewis, I can go on Arthur Lewis for a long time. Arthur Lewis, the idea is very simple. And Hans Singer tells us that this idea has been borrowed or taken from the work of Kurt Mandelbaum, otherwise known as Kurt Martin, who wrote that famous book in 1944, also, I think, on economic development in Southern Europe, which is again to do the absorption of surplus labor through industrialization. And the idea is from there. They were both in Birmingham, and Hans Singer was around, and he said that this idea came from Kurt Mandelbaum, and Lewis put it in that 1952 paper. But there are problems with that paper. The basic idea is simple, that you demand curve shifts, and you go along the flat part of the supply curve. At some stage, it starts going up, and the supply price of labor rises, and wage goes. That's the turning point, and that means surplus labor being absorbed. But before that, there are lots of analytical problems and theoretical problems in that depiction of Lewis. And many of those problems are a lack of sociological appreciation of what a family unit is in decision-making. So I think I have to stop there. Stiglitz, I agree with you. Stiglitz was there in Cambridge and fighting with all the Cambridge people there. I don't know, in Arabic I can't say it, but he's radical heterodox. But I can say it in Urdu, and then I'll translate it for you. It is somebody who's changed faith, at some point. And so the saying is, saw is 100. Saw chue khake. Chua is a rat. Mice. After eating 100 mice, the cat is now going on a hajj. You see? And that applies quite nicely to some of these people. But Lance Taylor I have a lot of time for. I have no, but I was not looking at, as I said, at the American school. But you must also accept that in America, you can count the non-mainstream people on the fingers and the toes of this thing. There aren't very many. So your new school, you have 2 or 3 other places, and that's it. That's it. And the other side doesn't accept these people as being economists.
Thank you very much. I think I hope we can finish by 8:15. So I will ask you to please be brief in your question or comment, and then Richard, and finally, Dean El-Mikawi, and then I'll ask you also to be brief, please.
Is it me?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so thank you very much for this great and rich lecture. My name is Awad Matariya. I work for WHO. I'm Director of Health Systems, but I'm also a health economist by training. So in the wonderful lecture and presentation, I only heard health once. There was a reference to pandemic, but health was only mentioned once. And I think just coming out from the pandemic or living through the pandemic, I mean, it has shown us the very importance of bringing in health into our discourse of economics. I was a bit puzzled when you referred to economics being a neutral science dissociated from value judgment. I think what we are trying to promote now at WHO, we had established a Council of Economics of Health for All, is to relook at all our economic systems and to put as a goal health for all, and under which we would bring in the equity agenda and other things. So if we are bringing in health into our discourse, how you would see the evolution of our our economic thinking and our economic system in that regard? Thank you very much.
Richard?
Yeah, thanks for that. That's a reminder of my alma mater. But I want to just pick up on what others said. In a way, when I think of the golden age of development economics, right? Myrdal, Rodenstein, Rodin, Singer, Hirschman, that tradition, the one thing they have in common is that they were not Anglo-Saxon. They didn't come out of the Anglo-Saxon. Their experience was not shaped by the Anglo-Saxon world. And if you go back even further, and Schumpeter and Liszt and all the way back to Colbert, there does seem to be a limitation in the Anglo-Saxon mind when it comes to thinking about development challenges. And I guess I worry if we focus on the Anglo-Saxon tradition that we forget that development is not just shaped by ideas, but it's shaped by history and interests. And I think history and interests outside of the Anglo-Saxon world have a very profound influence on the way in which development economics and thinking evolved. Thanks.
Thank you. Richard went all the way back to Colbert. Doctor, no?
Two quick questions that might actually be a change of gears. So it's okay if you decide to ignore them, because these are operational questions rather than substantive ones, but I think, in my humble opinion, important. Number one, there was a sub-message in your excellent lecture on how thought exercises hegemony and excludes heterodox ideas. And a subtext of that was, if you want to search for hegemony and hegemonic behavior, go out of academic journals into other areas that popularize ideas. I think I would want you to, if you do not want to dwell on this today, it would be useful for us to dwell on the issue of how hegemony in thought happens and how can today's alternative thinking learn from that, especially, and that's my last sentence on this, especially that we are living an age of very oppressive political economy, of media and all of its channels that build narratives. So I think the building of narratives and the disruption of narratives is a very important sub-theme in what you said, and it needs to be developed further, if not today, then some other day. Second and last operational question. Today we hear of the calls for reform of the Bretton Woods institutions, but they are all about how the Bretton Woods institutions are being governed internally. How much of that effort to reform the internal governance of the IMF and the World Bank do you think can open windows for heterodox development thinking?
Quickly.
You have 8 minutes.
I have 8 minutes. Eight is a popular number with as we all know from. Yeah, okay. I'll keep to that. Health. I entirely agree. I mean, health. You can take education. You can take all these other aspects. And they are profoundly important. I mentioned the things about the kind of crises, so I include in that there's a question of crisis of employment, which goes into education as well and skills. But we take health, there is also employment comes in. But people can't, there's also a question of what kind of health. We are talking about health, so many things. It's not just, physical capability in this way. It could be other forms of capability. It could also be issues of mental health. Many other aspects come into health. I think they're profoundly important. I completely agree. I mean, we could discuss this as well. But so I accept what you're saying. It's just in the time which is there, it's impossible to ping the name of every economist and every particular kind of thing. So I had to choose some points to be able to tell a story. And so I chose that kind of a story in this, because I think the heart of the story which I'm telling is about the collapse of the heterodox traditions, how it happened. It didn't happen in Sweden. It didn't happen in Germany. It didn't happen there. These were incidents there. Myrdal was a side figure in Swedish economics. After that, he got the Nobel Prize as an adjunct to. He got it along with Hayek, by the way, and his family was very upset. And he said later on that I shouldn't have accepted it along with this. Mirdal is very closely associated also with the work of Alan Young. It's also to do with economies in terms of scale and organizational changes in economy. So there are very powerful figures there. I don't want to belittle them just because they're not there. It doesn't mean that they are not, that I don't acknowledge them as being part of, the discourse on development. I mean, that would be, I haven't spent 50 years ignoring all these great names, so it's, we've studied all of them in school and so on. But as I said, my focus really at this time in this whole thing was really on this heterodoxy in economics. I don't think, while the others are development economists in many ways, Ashwani and so on, they're not really working as heterodox economists per se. They're not economists who are heterodox economists. They are development thinkers in a big way. So all I can say is, yes, I agree with the importance of others. So there's no way of saying that, the American tradition or the other continental traditions are belittled in this. But of course, there's a long list of names, whether from the UK, but also from the continent, who are actually quite hostile to the idea of development in these terms. And the main traditions which actually dominate economics, whether you go into Chicago or elsewhere, is the Austrian tradition. And the Austrian tradition is not necessarily a greatly progressive tradition in this whole thing. So that's the old Chicago school and so on. So I think there's Lance Taylor. I have a lot of time for Lance Taylor. The last thing I've read of his was wonderful, which was, yes, I know it's not 2 minutes. I'm taking a page out of Maria Angela's book. I can, just 2 minutes. So I think he did a critique of the axiomatic welfare economics that Amartya Sen does. And he said, what's the use of this? And of course, he does his modeling and his empirical work, applied work, which is very much like the work which Cambridge was doing for the UK. Structural change and all the rest of it, and what Stone and people were doing. But he was doing it so Chenery as well in that way, but Chenery and all these people were associated with political positions with regard to how growth and redistribution takes place. The famous project, which was there also based on IDS, incidentally, which was redistribution with growth, limited the idea of redistribution to the incremental growth. Now, what kind of a position is that? You see, there's no structural change, but you're not talking about a redistribution. So, but even a person like James Mead, who I ignored here, but James Mead sitting in Cambridge, thoroughbred neoclassical, all the WTO and GATT and all the rest of it talking about, he wrote the grammar, book of grammar on these things. His thing is that don't interfere with the market. The trouble is the things that are there at the end are bad because people come with those bad things at the start, but the market as a mechanism don't interfere with. He's a neoclassical of that kind. So how do you correct it? His idea of correction, he's a eugenics man, by the way, so I won't go so far, but he has a book in 1964 on education, on equity, efficiency, and the ownership of property. And he wants massive inheritance taxes. He wants an educational system which is the same, no public school tithe. He wants the same educational system going across, and he wants progressive taxation and so on. So there's a very radical agenda there, which is also possible in these regards. So I think there are many people that, there's no time to go into all of these, but I accept that there are many people whose work is not represented directly. Now, so forgive me, I can't go beyond this in this too far, but I have a lot of time for many of them, and you can agree with some things and not with others. I think your points I take very well. I would like you, if you have the interest, to scan through one of the chapters of this book I'm talking about. It's a chapter, but it's like a small monograph. It's 110 pages, but it's about how the neoliberal side actually managed to first develop the message, and then to diffuse the message, spread it, then to brand the message as stamping through all these, and then it was to do for that message to enter the policy domain. And so now there it is such a powerful network. You find that this whole thing, which is also the Montpellier Society and the Atlas Network, there are hundreds and hundreds of NGOs and civil society organizations that they fund. And the money comes from major donors in the US. Now the last round was Koch brothers. It started off somewhere else, but that's the kind of a chain which you have. Now, can you find people on the other side who are willing to be able to do this in a sustainable way? And can you actually overcome the role that the other side has, the control that they have with the media? You put your finger on that. You put your finger on that. So I think it's a challenge. What you say is extremely important. I think it's actually profoundly important. But we can only carry the message into the classroom and into popular press things. It shouldn't be just in academic journals. It should be shared in public discourse as much as possible. And that's what you people are doing, so that's very nice. So there you are, a bit of a mixture. Some you are happy with some answers and not happy with others. I can't help that, but I wouldn't accept many people as being imperialists, and I don't think that the non-Anglo-Saxons have been left out. Yes, they have. How many names do you want me to take? Please stay on. I'll carry on for another 1 hour. No problems. No problems.
Thank you very much, Ashwani, for this extremely instructive and educational lecture. And I'm sure that the audience will join me in thanking him and putting our hands together.